Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Let's keep week 38 going with today's Tolkien Tuesday. Now, for this series, we've been getting to know Tolkien's circle of literary friends, the Inklings, a bit better. And we've been using Humphrey Carpenter's excellent book to help us. Let's pick up where we left off last time as Tolkien shared part of The Jest of Beren and Luthien with his new fellow northernness-loving friend, C.S. Lewis. Now, when we ended last week, it was in December of 1929, just a few days after that 2:30 in the morning talk about the gods and giants of Asgard, and Tolkien has now showed Lewis his unfinished epic poem. Carpenter even provides a few lines to give us an idea of what Lewis was reading. There once and long ago, before the sun and moon we know were lit to sail above the world, when first the shaggy woods unfurled and shadowy shapes did stare and roam beneath a dark and starry dome that hung above the dawn of earth, the silences with silver mirth were shaken and the rocks were ringing, the birds of Melian were singing, the first to sing in mortal lands. Now, Lewis really enjoyed it. Now, it's not to say he didn't have suggestions and the like, but his overall impression of Tolkien's work was positive. In fact, he wrote back later that week to Tolkien. Just a line to say that I sat up late last night and have read The Jest as far as to where Beren and his gnomish allies defeat the patrol of the orcs above the sources of the Narog and disguise themselves. I can quite honestly say that it is ages since I have had an evening of such delight, and the personal interest of reading a friend's work had very little to do with it. I should have enjoyed it just as well if I'd picked it up at a bookshop by an unknown author. Now, as a reminder, folks, if you are, for some unusual reason, not listening to First Age Fridays this series, maybe you're pining for the return of Fandom Friday and are boycotting me or something, please reconsider. I'm reading the Lay of Leithian, or at least through a few cantos this series, and you get to experience a bit of what Lewis is talking about here. Now, Lewis goes on to explain what it is about Tolkien's epic poem that stands out, and I think you're going to love this. He says, the sense of reality in the background, that's one, and the mythical value. The essence of a myth being that it should have no taint of allegory to the maker, and yet should suggest incipient allegories to the reader. Well, that first element, of course, is the inner consistency of reality that Tolkien talks about in his seminal essay on fairy stories, and it's a huge part of the reason for the success of Middle-earth. The feeling throughout the works that this is a genuinely real place. But I also love what Lewis says about allegory here. It shouldn't be allegorical to the writer, but instead suggest allegories to the reader. In other words, really, applicability rather than the domination of the author. Now, I have to admit, I find it a bit ironic that Lewis, who would later employ allegory with a very heavy pen, would say this, but it is a great observation. Still, Lewis didn't leave it be. He had suggestions, but, and I love this, he treated it like it was a historical piece of ancient literature, studied by authors for years. He even argued, Carpenter writes, that any weaknesses in Tolkien's verses were the result of scribal errors or corruptions in the manuscript. Now, that's certainly an argument that Tolkien himself was unafraid to make later on when it comes to translating the Red Book of Westmarch. Lewis, though, also went as far as to rewrite entire lines or even stanzas, including one that he described historically as probably contemporary with the earliest manuscript of The Jest. But the thing is, Lewis's poetry differed greatly from Tolkien's. Ronald had what Carpenter calls an unadorned style, often resulting in lines that were terse and dramatic, while Lewis's poetry was, quote, more complex philosophically and stylistically, more sure in diction and meter, but they often hovered on the borders of pastiche, meaning they were imitative. Now, needless to say, Tolkien didn't agree with all of Lewis's suggested changes. One line of Tolkien's was, hateful thou art, O land of trees, my flute shall fingers no more seize. But Lewis thought it would be better as, O hateful land of trees, be mute, my fingers now forget the flute. According to Carpenter, Tolkien scribbled in the margin, frightful 18th century. And to be sure he got the point across, Tolkien wrote 3 exclamation marks even. Now, Carpenter gives us another example. Tolkien's line about Feanor's famous jewels read, the peerless Silmarils and 3 alone he made. And Lewis thought it should be, the Silmarils, the Shiners 3 alone he made. The Shiners 3. Tolkien didn't even have words, according to Carpenter. He just contemptuously underlined the last 3 words and scribbled a large exclamation mark beside them. Shiners? Yeah, I'm with you on this one, Professor. Anyway, Tolkien really loved and appreciated the energy and enthusiasm that Lewis had for his work, and he really did listen to his criticisms. According to Carpenter, Tolkien marked for revision almost all the lines that Lewis thought were inadequate, and in a few cases, actually adopted Lewis's proposed emendations, including several whole lines. Now, Tolkien eventually started reading more of his first-stage material, the Silmarillion, out loud to Lewis, who enjoyed listening, maybe even a bit more than reading. Lewis, Carpenter writes, was delighted, for Tolkien's poems and prose tales reminded him in many ways of the romantic writings of Malory and William Morris, in which he and Arthur Greeves had reveled during adolescence. And though Lewis didn't accurately describe Tolkien's work to Greeves in his letters all the time, his enthusiasm was vital to Tolkien. And for that, we're going to go back to Carpenter one more time. He writes, "The unpayable debt that I owe to him," Tolkien wrote of Lewis years later, "was not influence as it is ordinarily understood, but sheer encouragement. He was for long my only audience. Only from him did I ever get the idea that my stuff could be more than a private hobby." Thank you, then, to C.S. Lewis for encouraging my favorite author so that we could read his stuff. And folks, that wraps it up for this week's Tolkien Tuesday. Please join me again next week as we talk about mythology and an evening stroll with Lewis, Tolkien, and Hugo Dyson. Please visit patreon.com/Tolkien Times to learn how you can support the show, get an ad-free feed, join my content council, get a bonus episode every week, and more. And join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Word Nerd Wednesday. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Please follow or subscribe in your podcast apps, and follow @Tolkien Times on social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.